February 26, 2022. 2 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and the European Union made a decision that would permanently alter the global financial system. They announced that Russia would be cut off from SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. SWIFT is the messaging network that connects more than 11,000 banks across 200 countries, processing roughly $5 trillion in transactions every single day. Cutting Russia off meant its banks could no longer send or receive international payments, trade finance came to a halt, cross-border transactions were frozen, and Russia faced sudden economic isolation. In the West, this move was celebrated as the nuclear option of financial sanctions. Russia was expected to be crippled, the ruble was supposed to collapse, and Vladimir Putin was assumed to be forced into retreat or face political unrest at home. But 2.5 years later, something unexpected happened. Russia did not collapse, the ruble recovered, and Russian trade continued, just not through SWIFT. Russia adapted and found alternatives. More importantly, dozens of other countries were watching closely. They saw what happened and began building alternatives of their own. Because if the United States could cut Russia off from the global financial system for political reasons, it could do the same to anyone. This was not the first time a dominant power weaponized financial infrastructure. It has happened 4 times in the last 110 years. And every time the same pattern emerged. The dominant power weaponizes the system, the targets adapt, neutral countries hedge their exposure, and over time the original weapon steadily loses its power. The dominant power believes it is exercising ultimate leverage, but in reality it is undermining the foundation of its own dominance. In this story you will see the historical examples, the repeating pattern, the data proving this shift is already underway, why China stands to benefit the most, and why the timeline suggests the United States may have roughly 20 years before the dollar loses its reserve currency status entirely. When Britain weaponized finance in 1914, it lost reserve status by 1944, just 30 years later. The United States weaponized SWIFT in 2022, and the clock is already ticking. This time the decline may happen even faster, because alternatives already exist, and modern technology accelerates everything. SWIFT isn't a bank. It doesn't hold money, and it doesn't actually transfer money. SWIFT is a messaging system. When Bank A in New York wants to send $1 million to Bank B in Tokyo, SWIFT transmits the secure financial message between them. The money itself moves through correspondent banking relationships behind the scenes. But SWIFT is the communication network that makes the entire process possible. Created in 1973 by 239 banks across 15 countries, SWIFT replaced the slow and insecure telex systems that came before it. By 1977, it was already processing 10 million messages per year. By 2024, that number had grown to more than 11 billion messages annually, roughly 45 million messages every single day. Over time, SWIFT became the nervous system of global finance. What makes SWIFT so powerful is its unique position. It is based in Belgium and is technically neutral, but its board is dominated by American and European banks. More importantly, the United States holds legal and financial leverage because most international transactions ultimately settle in US dollars through New York-based banks. This gives Washington the ability to pressure SWIFT to exclude specific countries or financial institutions. And once you are cut off from SWIFT, conducting international trade becomes extremely difficult, leaving countries economically isolated from the global system. Financial weaponization almost always backfires, and the pattern has repeated 4 times over the last century. Each time, the dominant power believed it had ultimate leverage, and each time it accelerated its own decline. The first example is Britain during World War I. Before the war, the British pound was the world's reserve currency, and Britain controlled roughly 65% of global reserves. When war began in August 1914, Britain passed the Trading with the Enemy Act, allowing it to freeze the assets of German nationals and companies. British authorities seized German-owned businesses, bank accounts, ships, and property throughout the empire. This was unprecedented because international finance had historically been kept separate from warfare, and Britain broke that norm. The immediate impact on Germany was severe, but neutral countries were watching closely and learned a dangerous lesson. If Britain could seize German assets, it could seize anyone's assets during any conflict it deemed important. After the war, neutral countries began diversifying reserves away from London, increasing gold holdings and opening accounts in New York, Paris, and other financial centers. The United States benefited enormously from this shift. By 1920, the U.S. held more gold reserves than Britain, and by 1944, at Bretton Woods, the dollar formally replaced the pound as the world's reserve currency. Britain's decision to weaponize finance in 1914 marked the beginning of a 30-year decline from dominance to irrelevance. The second example came in 1979 when Iranian revolutionaries took American hostages. In response, President Carter froze all Iranian assets held in U.S. banks, roughly $12 billion, the largest asset freeze in history at the time. Tactically, the move worked, and the hostages were released in January 1981, partly due to economic pressure. Strategically, however, the consequences were profound. Countries around the world, especially in the Middle East and among OPEC members, realized that dollar reserves held in U.S. banks could be seized by executive order. During the 1980s, OPEC nations diversified their reserves, reducing dollar holdings from about 85% in 1977 to roughly 71% by 1991, while increasing exposure to Deutsche Marks, yen, and gold. The United States gained leverage over Iran, but it lost trust from everyone else. The third example followed Russia's annexation of Crimea in March 2014. The U.S. imposed targeted sanctions but stopped short of cutting Russia off from SWIFT, signaling disapproval without forcing full economic separation. This turned out to be a strategic mistake because it gave Russia 8 years to prepare. Between 2014 and 2022, Russia systematically reduced its dependence on the dollar, cutting U.S. Treasury holdings from $130 billion to just $2 billion, increasing gold reserves from 1,000 tons to more than 2,300 tons, developing its own SWIFT alternative known as SPFS, and negotiating trade agreements with China, India, and others that allowed settlement in rubles, yuan, or rupees. Vladimir Putin openly stated that Russia was reducing dollar exposure because dollar reserves were unsafe, a warning many Western analysts dismissed as bluster. It wasn't. When the fourth and most significant episode arrived in 2022, Russia was ready. On February 26th, the US and European Union announced that major Russian banks would be cut off from SWIFT and that $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held in Western institutions would be frozen. The immediate impact was dramatic. The ruble fell 30% in 2 days, the Russian stock market closed, ATMs ran out of cash, and Western media declared economic victory. But then something unexpected happened. The Russian central bank raised interest rates to 20%, stabilizing the currency, and Russia demanded that European buyers pay for natural gas in rubles, creating artificial demand. Within 3 months, the ruble had recovered its losses. Russian trade continued, simply rerouted through non-Western channels, with oil exports redirected to China, India, and the Middle East and settled in yuan, rupees, and rubles. By 2023, Russian GDP grew by 3.6%, faster than Germany or the United Kingdom. The real damage, however, was not done to Russia. It was done to the dollar and to SWIFT, because every country watching understood that the United States was willing to freeze reserves and cut access to global financial infrastructure for political reasons. For countries like China, India, Saudi Arabia, or Brazil, the question became unavoidable. We are not in conflict with the U.S. today, but what happens if we are tomorrow? The precedent had been set, and just as Britain's rivals did in 1914 and Iran's partners did after 1979, these countries responded the same way. They diversified away from the dollar, reduced reliance on SWIFT, and began building alternatives of their own. This is how financial weapons backfire, and it has happened 4 times before. It is happening again right now. The first stage begins when a dominant power controls the global payment system. From 1973 until 2022, the United States effectively controlled SWIFT, not directly, since SWIFT is based in Belgium, but indirectly, because most SWIFT transactions ultimately settle in US dollars through New York banks, giving Washington enormous leverage. The second stage is weaponization for foreign policy. From 2001 to 2022, the United States increasingly relied on financial sanctions. After September 11th, sanctions initially targeted terrorist financing, but they soon expanded to Iran, then North Korea, and eventually Russia in 2014. Each escalation normalized the idea of financial warfare. By 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, using SWIFT as a weapon seemed obvious, so the United States and its allies cut Russia off and froze $300 billion in central bank reserves. The third stage follows immediately as targets are forced to find alternatives. Unable to use SWIFT, Russia turned to other systems. Its domestic payment network, SPFS, expanded rapidly. China's cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, became a primary channel. Some transactions moved through cryptocurrency, while others relied on barter arrangements. By 2024, roughly 40% of Russian trade was conducted in non-dollar currencies, and Russia-China trade reached $240 billion in 2023, almost entirely settled in yuan and rubles. Russia demonstrated that a country can be cut off from SWIFT and the dollar system and still survive. The fourth stage is the most critical because it involves neutral countries hedging their exposure. This is no longer just about Russia. It is about dozens of countries that are not sanctioned today, but fear they could be tomorrow. China watched what happened and accelerated de-dollarization, reducing U.S. Treasury holdings from $1.3 trillion in 2013 to about $775 billion by 2024, dramatically increasing gold reserves to an official 2,264 tons, with unofficial estimates far higher, and expanding CIPS from processing roughly $300 billion in 2021 to more than $500 billion by 2024. Saudi Arabia, a U.S. ally for nearly 80 years, also reassessed its position. In March 2023, it announced it would accept yuan for oil sales to China, breaking a 50-year petrodollar monopoly, and in December 2024, it joined BRICS, signaling a shift away from exclusive alignment with Washington. The United Arab Emirates began settling trade with India in rupees and dirhams, bypassing the dollar. Brazil and Argentina explored a shared currency for bilateral trade. The BRICS bloc, now expanded to 9 members, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Egypt, and Ethiopia, has begun developing a shared payment system and openly discussing a common currency backed by gold and commodities. Even close U.S. allies are hedging. The European Union developed Instex as an alternative payment mechanism, and more than 50 central banks around the world are now testing or implementing systems designed to reduce dependence on the dollar and SWIFT. This shift is not driven by anti-American sentiment. It is driven by the realization that $300 billion in reserves can be frozen with a single executive decision. The fifth and final stage is where we are now as the original weapon begins to lose its power. SWIFT remains dominant, but its influence is eroding. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from 71% in 1999 to 58% by 2024, a 13-point drop representing trillions of dollars in diversification. More importantly, the dollar's share of international trade settlement has declined from roughly 73% in 2022 to about 58% by 2024, a 15-point drop in just 2 years, the fastest de-dollarization in modern history. Alternative systems are scaling rapidly, with SIEPs processing 136 million messages in 2023, up from 91 million the year before, representing 50% growth in a single year. The SWIFT weapon worked tactically in the short term, but strategically it failed. Russia survived, and the weapon can never be used again with the same effectiveness, because future targets will expect it and prepare for it. This is the repeating pattern. Control the system, weaponize it, targets find alternatives, neutral countries hedge, and the original weapon loses power. Britain went through this cycle from 1914 to 1944. The United States entered it in 2022, and the timeline suggests it will play out over the next 20 years. These are not predictions. They are observable facts supported by data. Start with Russian trade. In 2021, before sanctions, roughly 87% of Russian trade was settled in dollars or euros. By 2024, that number had fallen to about 60%, meaning 40% of Russian trade is now conducted in yuan, rubles, rupees, dirhams, and other currencies. Russia-China bilateral trade reached $240 billion, almost entirely settled in yuan and rubles, while Russia-India trade reached roughly $65 billion, largely settled in rupees. Then there is China's cross-border interbank payment system, or CIPS. In 2020, CIPS processed about $12 trillion over the full year. By 2023, that figure had risen to approximately $27 trillion, more than doubling in just 3 years. CIPS now connects over 1,400 financial institutions across 110 countries, making it a direct and rapidly growing alternative to the dollar SWIFT system, and it is expanding faster than SWIFT itself. Central bank gold purchases tell the same story. In 2022, central banks bought 1,136 tons of gold. In 2023, they bought 1,037 tons. In 2024, purchases again exceeded 1,000 tons. That is 3 consecutive years of sustained buying at levels not seen since the 1970s, just before the collapse of Bretton Woods. The largest buyers include China, Russia, Turkey, India, Poland, Singapore, and the Czech Republic, countries that are converting dollar reserves into gold because gold cannot be frozen or sanctioned. The petrodollar system is also weakening. For 50 years, oil was priced and sold almost exclusively in US dollars, but between 2023 and 2024, that monopoly began to break. Saudi Arabia started accepting yuan for oil sales to China. Russia sold oil to India in rupees. The UAE accepted payments in dirhams and yuan. Iran sold oil to China in yuan. The petrodollar is not dead, but it is no longer a monopoly, and once a monopoly breaks, its advantage erodes quickly. Finally, consider BRICS. In 2024, BRICS expanded from 5 to 9 members. Together, these countries account for roughly 45% of the world's population, 36% of global GDP, and 42% of global oil production. At the 2023 BRICS Summit, members announced plans to develop a common currency backed by commodities including gold, oil, and rare earths. Taken together, this data is overwhelming. De-dollarization is not a future risk or a hypothetical scenario. It is happening right now, and the pace is accelerating. We can estimate the timeline by looking at Britain's historical decline. In 1914, Britain weaponized finance by seizing German assets, and in 1944, at Bretton Woods, the US dollar formally replaced the British pound as the world's reserve currency. That was a 30-year transition from financial weaponization to replacement. Britain's decline, however, was accelerated by 2 world wars that devastated its economy, while the United States is not currently fighting wars on that scale, which could suggest a slower decline. At the same time, modern technology dramatically accelerates everything. In 1914, building alternative financial and payment systems took decades. In contrast, by 2024, China's CIPS system scaled from roughly $12 trillion in annual volume to $27 trillion in just 3 years. Digital payment systems can expand exponentially, which means the transition away from dollar dominance could happen faster, not slower. Based on these factors, a reasonable estimate is 15 to 25 years from 2022. That places the erosion of dollar reserve dominance somewhere between 2037 and 2047, not as a complete elimination of the dollar, but as a loss of clear dominance. Under this scenario, the dollar's share of global reserves could fall from about 58% today to roughly 35 to 40% by around 2040. The trajectory is already set, and at the current accelerating pace, critical thresholds are likely reached by the mid-2030s. This is not a timeline measured in centuries or generations. It is measured in 1 or 2 decades. Right now, the United States can run massive budget deficits because the world needs dollars for trade and for reserve holdings. Foreign governments and institutions buy U.S. Treasury bonds to obtain those dollars, which allows Washington to borrow roughly $2 trillion per year at relatively low interest rates. This privilege exists because the dollar dominates global reserves. But when the dollar's share of reserves falls below roughly 40%, that advantage begins to disappear. Foreign demand for U.S. treasuries weakens or collapses, interest rates rise sharply, and running large deficits becomes far more difficult. At that point, the government must either rein in spending, raise taxes, or finance deficits through money creation, which risks inflation. The American standard of living, which has long depended on importing more than the country exports and settling the difference with newly created dollars, becomes increasingly unsustainable. This is the moment when the free lunch ends. There are clear winners and losers in this shift. China is the largest winner. It is the most obvious successor to U.S. financial dominance, with the second largest economy in the world, the largest manufacturing base, the highest trade volume, and a currency that is increasingly used for reserves and settlement. CPS functions as China's alternative to SWIFT, and as the dollar's dominance weakens, the yuan steadily gains ground. China does not need to defeat the United States militarily. It only needs to wait for the dollar to erode under its own structural contradictions, a process accelerated by American financial weaponization. Russia also wins strategically. By surviving a swift cutoff and large-scale sanctions, Russia demonstrated that a major economy can function outside the dollar SWIFT system. That demonstration effect matters more than Russia's individual outcome, because it shattered the perception of absolute U.S. financial power and showed other countries that alternatives exist. The BRICS nations benefit as well. Brazil, India, South Africa, and the newer members all gain leverage in a multipolar currency system. India is the clearest example, maintaining relations with Russia despite U.S. pressure, purchasing discounted Russian oil, settling trade in rupees, and facing no serious consequences. Gold is another winner. As trust in fiat currencies erodes, central banks turn to gold, and global gold purchases by central banks are now at their highest levels in more than 50 years. The losers are equally clear. The United States gradually loses financial hegemony, not suddenly or catastrophically, but steadily and irreversibly. Dollar reserve status is the foundation of American power. It enables unlimited deficit spending, effective sanctions, and a standard of living built on consuming more than the country produces. As dollar dominance fades, these advantages weaken and eventually disappear. This does not mean the United States becomes poor. It means the United States becomes normal, still large and wealthy, but no longer a singular hyperpower. Europe loses alongside the U.S. European economies tied themselves closely to the dollar-based system and joined U.S. sanctions against Russia. As the dollar declines, the euro does not automatically replace it. The yuan gains instead, leaving Europe increasingly subordinate to both American and Chinese financial influence. SWIFT itself also loses relevance. As countries diversify away from Western financial infrastructure, SWIFT usage declines. The system will not vanish, but it becomes just one option among many rather than the dominant global network. Holders of dollar-denominated assets lose purchasing power as well, not through sudden collapse or hyperinflation, but through persistent annual erosion in the range of 5 to 10% as the dollar weakens over time. Finally, American consumers bear the cost. The United States runs a trade deficit of roughly $800 billion per year, a model that works only as long as foreigners are willing to accept dollars. When that willingness declines, the U.S. must export more or import less, leading to fewer goods, higher prices, and lower living standards. The timeline is already set. The SWIFT weapon was used in 2022, and that single decision triggered the 5-stage backfire pattern. We are now firmly in Stage 4, where neutral countries hedge their exposure, and Stage 5, where the weapon begins to lose its power, is starting to unfold. By 2030, the dollar's share of global reserves is likely to fall toward 50%. By 2040, it may fall closer to 40%. The United States will still hold the largest single currency share, but it will no longer enjoy true dominance. The world will be multipolar, and American financial power will be weaker as a result. In February 2022, the SWIFT weapon looked overwhelming. Russia was cut off, reserves were frozen, maximum pressure was applied, but financial weapons function much like nuclear weapons. You can only use them once. After you use them, everyone builds defenses. Russia built alternatives. China accelerated CIPS. BRICS expanded. The petrodollar monopoly fractured. As a result, the SWIFT weapon has lost its effectiveness because any future target has already built alternatives or is actively building them now. The United States could have preserved dollar dominance through economic strength, open trade, and predictable rule-based systems. Instead, it chose financial weaponization, freezing assets, cutting off SWIFT, and turning the dollar into an instrument of coercion. This approach worked tactically against smaller countries like Iran, but against Russia, it backfired and the consequences were systemic. This is not just Russia moving away from the dollar system, it is half the world. Britain followed this same path. It weaponized finance in 1914 and lost reserve currency status by 1944. The United States weaponized SWIFT in 2022, and the historical pattern suggests dollar dominance erodes by the early 2040s, possibly sooner because modern technology accelerates everything. This is not a prediction. It is pattern recognition. Financial weapons always backfire. The dominant power believes it is exercising ultimate leverage, but in reality, it is teaching the world how to build alternatives. And once those alternatives exist, the original system loses power. The SWIFT weapon destroyed SWIFT's monopoly. The dollar weapon weakened dollar hegemony. The country that benefits most is China, the patient rival that watched the United States undermine its own advantages. China did not defeat America militarily. It did not need to. America weakened itself by weaponizing the tools of its own dominance. The 5-stage pattern is now clear. The United States controlled SWIFT and the dollar. It weaponized them against Russia. Russia built alternatives. More than 50 countries are now hedging, and the weapon is losing power. This is the end of dollar hegemony, not with a bang, but with a whimper, not through military defeat, but through financial self-destruction. The SWIFT weapon worked once. It will never work again because the world learned the lesson. Build alternatives, diversify away from dollars, and never remain vulnerable to U.S. financial power. The dollar will decline. The yuan will rise. The world will become multipolar, and the United States will be weaker, not because of Chinese aggression, but because of American policy. The United States had the golden goose, and it strangled it with sanctions. Welcome to the post-dollar world. It is not fully here yet, but it is coming. The timeline is set. The pattern is clear. The SWIFT weapon was the trigger, and 20 years from now, Historians will look back at February 2022 and say, that was the moment American financial dominance truly ended, even if no one realized it at the time.